St. Paul has a very difficult job in the reading today. He has to explain to people why the laws of the Old Testament were good, but also not good enough. He can't criticize the laws so much that they sound bad, because God gave them the law, and if God gave them a bad law, then God would be bad. So St. Paul's not trying to say that the law is bad, but he is trying to say that it's not good enough. That we need more than just the Old Testament law. We need Jesus Christ. St. Paul goes so far as to call it the law of sin and death. Those are pretty strong words to use for a law that was given to us by God. How can he say that? How can this be understood? I didn't understand it until the year 2020. Remember 2020 when we all developed new hobbies because we had all this free time and we couldn't mingle with other people? So the hobby that I developed in 2020, one of them at least, was mountain biking. And I did a little bit of research to learn what mountain biking is all about. You know, you would think that mountain biking trails would be clear of all obstacles so that you can bike on them. But that's actually not true. Mountain bikers like the obstacles. And the more advanced the trail, the more obstacles there will be. Roots and rocks. Because the bikers like to assess their path and think about, okay, how do I need to handle this trail to be able to get through it? If you make a mistake, you might hit a big rock, come to an abrupt stop, and maybe even fall off your bike. But if you do it right, you're weaving through the trail, dodging roots, dodging rocks, maybe doing a small wheelie over a root, or even a bunny hop if you have to. That's the fun of mountain biking. So I got into that a little bit. I bought my mountain bike and I started with easier trails and tried to work my way up. And even months into mountain biking, I was still making this very silly mistake. I would see a rock or an obstacle on the trail, and I would realize in my mind, I need to avoid that rock. And then I would approach the rock, and I would go right into it. And it's not like it was hard. There was plenty of space on the right or on the left or wherever I needed to go to avoid it, but I would just run right into it, and I would do it over and over and over again. I couldn't understand it. It's like there was a magnet pulling me to everything that I wanted to avoid. So I thought about this and I got some advice, and what I learned is that the bike will go to what I'm focusing on. I was focusing on the obstacles. And I was thinking in my mind, yes, I want to avoid them, but nevertheless, my focus was on the obstacles. So even though I wanted to avoid them, I was still running right into them. And I made a shift in my mind, and I said, okay, instead of focusing on the obstacles and what I want to avoid, I'm going to focus on the path that I need to take. Instead of focusing on what I don't want to hit, I'm going to focus on where I do want to drive. And that's how I got better at mountain biking. The law is good, but sometimes it gets us to focus on what not to do instead of on what we should be doing. If God had the chance, he wouldn't have given us the law. He wouldn't have put out all of these rules that told us what not to do. God much prefers to attract us to himself. And sometimes our relationship with God can fall apart into nothing but a set of rules. It can become negative. Here's what I shouldn't be doing. Here's all the sins that I committed that I shouldn't have done. It reminds me of this interesting story from the diary of St. Faustina. St. Faustina was very quantitative when she examined herself before confession. She would write out this list of sins, and she would write out how many times she committed each sin. And then one day she looked at one and said, I'm going to work really hard to not commit this sin anymore. And the day she committed to not committing the sin, she did it twice as much as she used to. How relatable is that? And she took this to prayer and she asked God, Lord, I'm trying even harder now not to do this, and I'm doing it even more. Why is that? And God said to her, the moment you committed to overcoming this sin, you stopped relying on my grace. You took everything into your own hands and tried to do it by yourself, and the result is that you sinned more. If you had instead surrendered to me, then I would help you overcome the sin. In our spiritual life, instead of focusing so much on the sins we've committed and the guilt that we feel as a result, let's focus on how powerfully forgiving and merciful God is, that He is willing to forgive our sins. And when we try to overcome our sins, let's not focus just on what not to do. Let's focus on what we do want to do. Instead of just getting rid of vices, what virtues do we want to grow in? And let's not focus just on the demons in the world and what influence and power they have over us. Let's focus on our relationship with God. The fact that He calls us His beloved children makes us sons and daughters. The difference between the law of death and the law of life is that the law of death tells you what to do and what not to do, and the law of death tells you who you are. And when you believe that you are royalty, when you believe that you are God's son or God's daughter, that He has chosen you and loves you, you will change the way that you live. You will act, we will act, according to the identity that we believe in. If I believe I am God's child, I will live as God's child. That's the law that God gives us. That's the law of life. The law that says I am God's child and I live as God's child. Doesn't mean there's no such thing as sin. It doesn't mean confession's not important. What it means is focus your life not on avoiding hell, but on gaining heaven. Then we will build our life on God's grace. He will take us by the hand and lead us to where He wants us to go.